The title of today's session is China's Internal Challenges and Possible Ways to Solve Them. So in last month's session, we looked at the class nature of China. And in that session, Khalid argued that despite the existence of a major private sector in China, that China remained a planned economy dominated by the public sector and ruled over by a Communist Party state machine. And in that sense, that China still has many similarities with the old Soviet Union, Soviet bloc. Of course, China uses a far more dynamic form of planning, investment and innovation. And as we talked about last time, it has a large private sector, which the Soviet Union didn't have. Anyway, the result of this unique combination between public and private has been to rapidly transform China from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the most successful. So what I want to talk about is not about the obvious successes that China has achieved, but about the problems that they're facing, and come up with some ideas about those problems and some suggestions for how they could be overcome. So, despite having made spectacular advances in the last 45 years, China now faces major contradictions. And we sent out a document a couple of weeks ago on this subject. It's part 2 of the 3 documents that we're doing on this subject. And we looked at some of these challenges that are facing China and discussed how we might overcome them. So the first one, and here I'm summarizing a lot of the stuff. So I hope there's some comrades had the chance to read through that document, because obviously that went into a lot more detail and could explain these things better. But I'm going to try and summarize the points for our comrades to be able to then discuss them. So first of all, we looked at the question of inequality. And inequality in China, while it has gone down since 2008, China's still a very unequal society. And we can see this in the massive amounts of billionaires. China has more billionaires than any other country in the world, including America. So that the fact that you can see there must be huge inequality. And we still have a large section of the population who are poor. Now, how could this issue of inequality be tackled? How might it be drastically reduced? And in the document, we go into some ideas on that. And to sum that up, I don't know, someone can mute themselves. Could they? Sajjad, maybe you could mute yourself. Sajjad? Thanks, man. Great. Now, one of the interesting things that's happened in China has been that over a period of 8 years, they ran a huge drive to end extreme poverty. So not only did China, through the growth of its economy, lift over 800 million people out of poverty. Sorry, somebody's got a lot of noise in the background. I wonder if somebody needs to mute themselves. I don't know if it's Khalid. Yeah, Khalid, maybe. Yeah. Oh, anyway, sorry about that. So that not only did China manage to lift over 800 million people, some people say 850 million people, out of poverty, but this still left a large number of people in extreme poverty, people who were in remote areas or areas of the economy that hadn't benefited from this growth. And obviously, one of the problems of China is geographically that most of the growth has happened in the eastern coastal areas, and to some extent further inland, but large areas of the country geographically didn't benefit so well. So that China launched a focused campaign where they mobilized millions of Communist Party members to go into the areas that are poor and to establish a relationship with very poor households, to build up a database of the very poor and identify what was wrong with their situation. You know, did they have problems with health? Did they have problems with housing? What way forward did they need extra education? Did they need help with getting small businesses? Did they need special work training and so on? And the end result was that 100 million people in extreme poverty were lifted out of extreme poverty by 2021. And the significance of this is that this is the first time that I know of in human history where any country has actually ended extreme poverty. And they did it, as I said, in a very conscious way. So I think it was a great achievement of the Communist Party in China. So my argument is that now that they've done this drive to end extreme poverty, they need to shift over to have a drive to end extreme wealth. And we go in the document into ways that could be done. If comrades got any questions on these things, we can detail those. The next important issue is on housing. There is a housing crisis in China, namely that first of all there was a huge migration of people from the countryside into the cities and towns of China has happened over the last 30, 40 years. So we're talking about, you know, possibly, I don't know, 700 million people moving into the city. And that's a huge, it's been regarded as one of the biggest migrations in human history. So that was bound to cause a huge demand for housing. And how could that be dealt with? Now, normally one would expect in a socialistic economy that the government would respond by use of public construction and public housing. And I give the example of what happened in Europe, for example, in Britain, which we know about. After the Second World War, there was a massive housing crisis caused by first by the war itself, which has caused a massive amount of bombing and damage of housing, but also many people in the cities in Britain were living in slums and tenements and so on. And it was the war had shown, when people had been called up to fight in the war, the state of health of the working class in Britain had shocked even the ruling class. And it became, after the end of the war, when Labour came to power, there was a whole new mood, which we've talked about in discussions about the manifesto and history, that there was a post-war settlement in which the ruling class agreed to basically, develop a welfare state, to have a health service, under great pressure of the labor movement and under the pressure of the Soviet competition. They agreed to all kinds of things, and one of them was that they agreed to have a big public house building drive by the public sector, by the local governments. And this was hugely successful. There were some problems with it, but it was a massive success in the 1950s. And this is the kind of thing that I think that China needed to have done. Michael Roberts, in his, I don't know if the comrades watch, read Michael Roberts' blog on Marxist economics, and he goes into this in some more detail. And I think he's very right on this question. Now, that unfortunately, the Chinese government didn't do this. They allowed the private sector to step in to meet this demand for housing in the cities, and this caused all sorts of problems, as we have seen in the West in the last 20 years. We've seen all these crises of the private housing sector, and the same sort of things happened in China. Number one, what it did was it caused a huge increase in the price of property and rents and so on, which continues to this day. So that's a big problem in the cities of China. And it also led to all kind of Ponzi schemes, and it got to a stage where people were buying housing, not just for themselves, but they were buying it for property speculation, because the prices were always rising, and so it seemed to be a great way to invest your money that you made in if you'd done well in the economy, which a lot of people did. And so all kinds of fraud emerged and so on. And of course, this all came to a head in about 3 or 4 years back when the Chinese government decided to crack down on the financing of it all. And this led to bankruptcy on a massive scale. Now, the Chinese government has managed to, unlike the West, the government has many economic tools which they don't have in the West, and has been able to avoid a huge crash. There's been some protests, but on a small scale, relatively small scale. And so they are managing to negotiate their way through this crisis. But the only real solution is, that I see, is for the Chinese government to move over from solving these problems through the private sector, but through the public sector. And we need the government needs to have government construction companies and to build housing for rent and so on. And this is the only real way to build safe and affordable housing on the scale needed to overcome the needs of China in this field. And there still is like 300 million people who are estimated eventually to move to the cities. So it's a massive problem. Then there comes the question of this migration that I talked about, and the thing called the hukou system. Now, the hukou system is a household registration system that was introduced in China in the late 50s. And this system identifies a person as being a resident of a particular area. And over time, this hukou system has hardened social inequalities in China by keeping the population divided into two classes, the rural and the urban. And with this massive migration of people from the countryside to the towns in the last 40 years, what it has done is it's created a lot of the people who've come into the cities. It's kind of kept them as second-class citizens, unable to access urban housing, education, and social services. Now, there is a process going on, which Heiko talked about in our last month's session. There is a process whereby tranches of these citizens are being brought into the full citizen rights. But this has got a long way to go, and I think this is an important issue in China that needs to be overcome. Another issue that Heiko talked about last time briefly is the question of public health. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go into this, but why these things develop that way. But China does not have a public health service in the normal sense of the word. That most of health is actually privately based, so that you have to pay. Now, the price of these charges are not so high as they are in the West, like in America and some other countries. But you still have to pay for most private health, for most procedures. And this is something that China needs to overcome and needs to develop a public health service. Now, of course, saying this is very easy to do, but when you've got a population of 1.4 billion people, the largest in the world, just about to be overtaken by India, and you're coming from a country which was one of the poorest countries in the world in 1949, to provide a free health service to everybody in the country is going to be a huge task. But this is something that definitely China needs to be doing and looking ahead to, and should be establishing as a vision that's aiming to, and putting forward steps to achieve that. And in our document, we also talk about how that China, as it gets richer, that it needs to develop a whole range of universal basic services, which are free, and they deliver things that, in terms of housing, in terms of food, increasingly provide services that are free of charge. And this is something that we in the left in the West are now arguing for in Western societies. Now, in outlining these points, these broad points, and there's many more, of course, we're fully conscious that these can only take the form of broad suggestions for improving China. And naturally, these suggestions reflect our own experiences of how we would wish society run in our own countries. But it's Chinese socialists themselves who are the ones who can determine the changes that are needed and flesh out the program needed to achieve them. And it's vital that we find ways to contact and interact with Chinese socialists. Now, next, very shortly, I'm about to launch a YouTube channel called Understanding China. And through that, I'm hoping to be able to gain links with a sizable Chinese audience. We're also planning to publish a book on China in the autumn. And through that, again, to get these ideas out and create an interaction with Chinese people. Without that, then this is all moot, isn't it? This is all just our ideas published in a vacuum. And the crucial factor will be that if we're able to, access Chinese population and get their feedback, they're the fundamental people here. Now, in the document, we also examine a series of questions about China that arise in the West, and I don't have time to go into any of these questions. Hopefully, if you've read the paper, you might have comments, or if you haven't, you feel free to ask questions about them. So these questions that we deal with are the question of media and censorship in China, the question of surveillance and privacy in China, which Heiko talked about last time, the question of Xinjiang, the largest province of China, the western province of China, where there's been all this propaganda from the West about genocide and forced labor and all sorts of things. We go into that in the document. We talk about Hong Kong and what's happened in Hong Kong in the last few years. And we also deal with the question of Taiwan, which is obviously becoming a hotter and hotter subject, and could be the basis of a hot war between America and China. America's obviously looking to have a fight with China to try to hold them down. But I haven't got time, unfortunately, to go into any of these questions. What I want to talk about are, first of all, the dangers of the private sector in China. Now, although the private sector, the incorporation and growth of the private sector in China has undoubtedly supplied a lot of dynamism to the Chinese economy and a lot of success in the Chinese economy, it also has produced a lot of problems. In fact, I would argue that many of the current problems in China have to be laid at the door of the private sector. So, for example, it's mostly the private and not the public sector that has caused economic inequality. It's also the private sector that has supplied most of the corruption in Chinese society, which there's been a huge campaign against corruption, but it's a continuing problem. And the reason being is that if you look at most of the cases, public officials have been approached by people with wealth from the private sector for them to give favorable decisions on their behalf and get involved in all kinds of schemes of land distribution and so on, land leasing and so on. We also see that a lot of the worst exploitation in China that goes on is in the private sector. And we're seeing that, with, and a lot of the migrant workers I talked about earlier, these migrant workers have ended up working for the private sector in the cities and towns. And we also see a lot of the, like these, there's been a lot of scandals in China about the delivery drivers. They're working for these private companies who are being overexploited and so on. And last but not least, the degradation of the environment in China, which they are now taking a lot of steps to overcome. A lot of that degradation came from private companies. So, and in a more broader sense, there is a danger that the rising wealth and power of the capitalists and the private sector in China will come to undermine the public sector and the state and the good things that we're seeing in Chinese development. So to counter this danger, the government has implemented a number of measures. One of the latest has been that in the largest companies, private companies, the government has taken a golden share. So in some cases, they've restructured the companies and split them up. But in many, they've taken a golden share where the government puts somebody on the boards of these companies with a kind of veto over decisions that the government deems as socially destructive. Now, this approach has been particularly applied to the big technology and financial companies that have recently grown up in China and threaten to dominate the economy as they are doing in the Western capitalist nations. Now, there's no doubt that this is a useful measure that the government is taking to rein in the power of these companies. And one of the things the government's trying to do is to curb the tendency towards monopoly practices and the growing abuse of power that has appeared in, if you look at the Western countries, we're seeing an increasing monopolization taking place. And the government in China is trying to rein that in and prevent that happening. And ironically, these latest steps that China's been taking to control the big tech and financial companies in China has been welcomed by many organizations representing small businesses and tech startups in China and elsewhere, because they feel that this is the only way to prevent e-commerce, finance, and the market gobbling up the smaller competition or destroying them. However, better regulation and taking seats on the boards of the biggest companies can only go so far. Once the private companies reach such a size that they become essential to the public good and they have a huge impact on society, in my view, and this is the position that Engels argued for in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, such companies need to logically be properly incorporated into the public sector. But this could raise problems. So, I mean, for example, how to do this without losing the current levels of efficiency and innovation that obviously exist in these companies. The state-owned enterprise model in China, while it plays a key role in the economy and is absolutely essential, is generally regarded as slower and more bureaucratic and less efficient, as we've seen in the public sector in the West. So I think we need to consider, the only way to overcome this is to consider a new model of governance for the public sector and society as a whole. Now, the two options that we have before us traditionally is capitalist democracy, and in China, the system of top-down bureaucratic rule. Now, what the West argues, and what a lot of the left in the West go along with, is this argument that China needs, in place of its top-down bureaucratic system of rule, they need to have a system of competitive democracy like the West. But I don't think I need to go into too much detail about this, but I think we all know that capitalist democracy in the West does not deliver rule by the people. And in fact, as neoliberalism has developed, what elements of democracy did exist in the West have increasingly been hollowed out as inequality has grown, as the state has been further and further privatized, as the media and the means of media manipulation have grown. We've found that so-called democracy has become yet another system for rule by the rich, and behind the mask of elections, the super wealthy control the outcome of elections through their ownership of the media, their donations to the political parties, their funding of election campaigns, and their payments to individual politicians. And so the results of the so-called democracy of the West has been that you get governments, more and more governments that serve the interests of the wealthy, and they oversee the impoverishment of the rest of society. And this is growing anger and discontent among the population, and growing instability and division. And people are increasingly becoming disillusioned with the Western democratic system. So that is obviously not the way forward for China. Ironically, although China's government is not elected by the public in a normal sense of the word, I mean, they do have elections in China, but these the Communist Party decides who the candidates are. So effectively, it's not the democracy as we'd recognize it. But ironically, the Chinese government is far more responsive to public pressure than the Western governments. And we've seen a whole number of examples of this. The most recent one was with the protests against the pandemic lockdowns last autumn. Even though these protests were they were blown up in the media internationally, but actually there weren't that many protests and they weren't that big. But despite that, within weeks of the protests, the government lifted the lockdowns, and in a more dramatic way than they did in the West. So one could argue that when protests do happen in China, which they do, you get demonstrations, you get strikes and so on, that the government is much more sensitive to these and much more responsive to them. And if you look at actually how the structure works in China, one of the main criteria for promotion for all Communist Party cadres when they want to be promoted to higher positions is that they have to be able to show that they have avoided public discontent in their area of responsibility. So, you know, that is not that doesn't enter into the question in the West, you know. But China's top-down bureaucratic governing system is far from the best structure for running society in China, in my view. Now, for example, the argument is often advanced by the Chinese bureaucracy that their system is based on meritocracy, where the top leaders have only achieved their position by proving themselves at the lower levels. Now, there's some truth in this. There's no question that if you look at, for example, if you look at the Politburo, you will in China, you will find that they are all very experienced people. Often they're ex-engineers and ex-scientists and people who actually had some expertise in their earlier career. And they usually always, to get to that position, they've had to be play a role as provincial party secretaries or whatever, in charge of large groups of people and having to deal with problems and solve those problems. So in that sense, there has been an element of meritocracy, unlike in the West, where you get people like, you know, like Trump, who becomes president, who's had no political experience at all, and whose main claim to fame was dodgy deals in the property sector, and then becoming a reality TV star in American television. And we see that in many countries that people become, they get elected. They get elected on the basis of them having star quality or you know, looking good or speaking well or whatever. Now, but even on the grounds of meritocracy, the studies been made of this system, and that promotion is not always made on the basis of performance. Many times, promotion in the Chinese system is influenced by favors, friendships, or whether one belongs to a particular ideological faction or whatever. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence and studies made that the meritocratic elements of Chinese government system are reported to be in decline. So, for example, according to a recent study of the survival of local party secretaries and their promotion during the current campaign against corruption, it's become apparent that meritocracy is giving way to patronage. And in some ways, that's an inevitable consequence of President Xi Jinping's growing power in the system. And at the lower levels, the Chinese system of rule from above inescapably leads to corruption. You know, when you think about it, if you've got so many officials giving out licenses and permissions to carry on business or sending off land to particular people, and these decisions are often taken without effective transparency, rule by the officials is bound to encourage the giving and taking of bribes. And for example, in the current ongoing anti-corruption campaign, 1.5 million officials have so far faced charges and discipline. I mean, that's a huge amount. And fresh scandals continue to come to light. I think in a way, corruption is baked into the current Chinese system. This rule from above also leads to many other abuses of power, where decisions are taken that damage the interests of the citizens, either for the convenience of the officials or to benefit someone that the official favors. And there's just been too many cases of such abuses in China. I mean, we saw, for example, a lot of local government finance comes from its sale of leases to use of land in their region. And we saw so many cases where, particularly as the cities were expanding, they were selling off land in the surrounding small towns and villages. And we saw all sorts of demonstrations by the people affected by those sales, which were obviously very corrupt. So the result of these abuses of officials by officials in China is a passive discontent among some of the citizens, and sometimes we see active protest strikes and so on. So what's the main response of the system to these problems is to discipline officials for abuse of office. But this actually only deals with the most extreme cases and leaves all the others in place. And it relies on higher officials knowing what is really happening underneath them, which is often not the case. It also depends on officials being willing to take action against officials below them guilty of misconduct. But often we've heard of cases where these things have actually, they covered up for these people because of family friendship, past favors, and so on. And where officials are disciplined, this is usually done after some time, often years later when the damage has been done and can't be easily reversed or compensated for. So the bureaucratic system in China not only leads to these abuses, but it also leads to inefficiency and major distortions. And I can give examples of that if we had time. The truth of the matter is that without input from the ordinary citizens who are affected by these decisions, officials regularly make mistakes, and sometimes very big mistakes, and will continue to do so. So China needs, in my view, needs a new form of governance, one that I call democratic public power. So this is basically a system of participatory democracy where all the people affected by decisions have a voice in making these decisions, where the running of each public service begins to involve accountable representation of the service users, the workforce, and other stakeholders. Or in other words, all those who are currently on the receiving end of decisions and regulations need to have a way to influence those decisions and regulations, where state-owned enterprises incorporate representatives of their workforce, their customers and suppliers as key partners in decisions on the price, quality, and design of products, along with production methods, forward investment, and so on, where every layer of the state gives the people a key say in the design and implementation of policy. Now, you might think this is all pie in the sky, but actually, we're starting to see in China steps in this direction. So instead of just having this binary choice between top-down rule by public officials in the public sector in China, or private ownership, total private ownership and control by capitalists in the private sector, we need a new system. And if we were to introduce that, we could find ways to dramatically improve the efficiency, innovation, and customer service of the public sector. And that would then mean that when they took private sector, large companies into the public sector, they wouldn't lose in terms of inefficiency and dynamism. I mean, if we involve the people in decision-making, we can unlock the creativity that exists among them and utilize this potential through mass participation through online technology. Now, China is the most online tech-savvy country in the world. They have the most people online. And in terms of their services, the Chinese people are now using online services more than any other country. So this is not something alien to them. And China has introduced a new concept of what they call whole process democracy. And they contrast this to the Western competitive democracy, which they point out the flaws of. And this is now involving a range of innovative rights for citizens to be consulted about things. For example, they give people the right to suggest new laws, something we don't generally have in individuals have the right to suggest new laws and can submit them. They are allowed to suggest amendments to draft laws. So when the law is passed, it doesn't automatically come into implementation. It's then circulated and people can comment on them and suggest amendments, and they do. And as a result, the laws are improved. The people are allowed to complain and see their complaints acted on. And these new rights are and I don't have time to go into details of this stuff, but this is delivering things that we don't have in the West. And such new rights are an excellent step forward, and they open up the way for further experiments in new forms of democracy that genuinely involve the people. Now, how could such changes happen? Now, one of the good things about the Chinese system is that they learned from the mistakes made by Mao in his period after he died. The Chinese realized that they, instead of just imposing new changes, that they needed to experiment with them and to see how they worked out in practice before implementing them on a national basis. And I would say that would be the same way we could introduce these ideas. So we could apply ideas for participatory democracy in maybe in a couple of national public services, maybe in a few state-owned enterprises, maybe in some local government areas, and see how they work out in practice. And if they were shown to be successful, or if they needed amendment, then they could be amended, then they could be spread across the whole of China. And of course, such new forms of democracy will be needed to be applied to the trade unions and the Communist Party itself. Now, naturally, there will be reluctance and resistance in many levels of the Chinese government to the introduction of such democratic public power. After all, it's hard to share power with the people when you've been used to exercising it alone. But the Chinese Communist Party has to trust its citizens and begin to take this next step if it's to overcome today's challenges and establish a genuinely democratic socialist future. Such a major step is not only relevant, however, to China. I would say that the lessons of, and in a way, China is a laboratory for the future. Not just for China, but for the world as a whole, and for the whole socialist project worldwide. For this experiment in real democracy addresses the powerlessness that exists everywhere in the world, and its outcome is of great relevance to humanity as a whole. So I just want to finish now by talking about, these ideas we've talked about here can only become real if they're taken on board by Chinese people. But it raises the question of what is our political strategy in China? In other words, are we aiming for political revolution, or are we aiming for political reform? And given that this program will drastically redistribute wealth and power downwards to the people, it's inevitable that many of the wealthy and powerful in China will want to resist such changes. Now, how could such resistance be overcome? Will it be by means of a political revolution through which the existing state apparatus and the Communist Party that maintains it be overthrown? Or will it take place as a result of decades of campaigning, experimentation, and reform? And I think from what I've said already, I think you realize that we believe, myself and Khalid, that it's the latter course that we should be arguing for. Now, this is a departure from our tradition. Traditionally, we come out of the Trotskyist movement traditionally, and the Trotskyist movement argued for political revolution rather than reform. But in our paper, we look back at what was the actual experience when socialists tried to do this in the Stalinist countries of the Soviet bloc. And we go into that in some detail. I don't have time to go into that now, but anybody who wants any questions about this. But one of the things when looking at that history, we realized that the strategy of political revolution that the socialists applied in the Soviet bloc didn't work. It failed. And in fact, as we looked in more detail at it, we saw that any move by the mass of people for change in these societies, which there were many, were inevitably reflected inside the Communist Party. And if people want to ask me questions, we can go into that in more detail about what was the experience of those struggles, because we can learn from them. Now, in the case of China, the opportunities for debate are comparably greater than in the former Stalinist states. So, for example, there's a huge number of institutes and organizations within the ambit of the Communist Party of China that are willing to discuss new ideas as long as they are positively seeking to reform the system rather than to overthrow it. And this approach is quite understandable given the threats that China is now facing from the neo-imperialist countries. We believe that those who argue for a strategy of political revolution involving the overthrow of the Communist Party of China, which is, for example, the comrades in the IMT, the comrades in CWI, and other Trotskyist groups, we believe this offers no credible way forward in China. And indeed, well, for one thing, the Chinese Communist Party is very popular in China. I mean, they do surveys, all kind of surveys by Western institutions that show that the overwhelming majority of people in China, they might have criticisms on this aspect, on that aspect, they might have gripes about this or that, but overall, they are very happy with the way that China is moving forward. And why wouldn't they be? They're seeing big improvements in their living standards, in all kind of other standards of living, in infrastructure, in all sorts of facilities in China. They see China's getting stronger and stronger economically. They're becoming more and more proud of the country. So it's not surprising that China's Communist Party is successful and popular. Not only that, the Chinese Communist Party has got almost 100 million members. I think it's 97 million members. And if you include their households, that's like about 20% of the whole population. So it's a huge organization. And then there's not just the Chinese Communist Party, it's all the organizations they control, like the trade union movement with its 250 million people. The Chinese Communist Party controls massive youth movements, women's movements. So you're talking about a huge institution. There's no way that I can see that even on a practical, if you wanted to achieve it, that you could overthrow such a thing. And we found in the history of the Soviet Union that policy never actually echoed with the population. That the natural instincts of the population was to reform their system, not to overthrow it, which is the normal attitude that working people have. So, and not only that, you're now in a situation where America and the West is increasingly attacking China in terms of propaganda, in terms of the economy, and could even go into a hot war. And in that situation, people would regard the idea of overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state as dangerous and counterproductive. I mean, we saw what happened when the Communist Party was overthrown in the Soviet Union, the disastrous result that had for the people, which led to a drastic fall in living standards, in health, led to the breakup of countries, a crash of the economy. And it's only now that Russia is starting to recover its old strength. And we don't want to see that in China. We don't want to see China break up with maybe Xinjiang and Tibet and the north and the southern states all breaking apart. This would throw into reverse all the gains that China has made in lifting people out of poverty. So I believe that that our strategy, and we have to grasp this nettle, that instead of trying to overthrow the Communist Party and the trade union movements that we have to go for a political strategy based on a major reform of the Chinese system, reform of the state, reform of the economy, reform of the Communist Party, reform of the trade unions. And that obviously we have to do this, we have to fight for this alongside Chinese people. And that's basically the main parts of this document. I hope that gives comrades some food for thought. Okay. So let's see where we are now. We've got 7 comrades participating. And can I ask for a comrade to come in with a contribution or questions or whatever? Roy. Okay.
Yeah, I don't mind making a couple of opening comments. I did read what I thought was a very good document, Pat. And I thought the only thing was missing was a summary, and you've just done it. So that makes it perfect. And I did come to the conclusion myself as well that the key issues were the private public sector balance, put it that way, in China, and democracy, and the involvement of the people in not only running society but understanding society, where, you know, in Britain we are inculcated with the assertions of how good our democracy is and all that stuff. And I think again, in China there needs to be an understanding, a proper understanding of how the dynamics of it and all goes. I mean, the main reason I say that is particularly what Heike was saying at the last meeting, when he's talked about how many Marxists there are in the Politburo or anywhere in any of these positions, very few. And you know, and I just wonder, you know, that people could very easily be persuaded to go in a different direction if things went a bit pear-shaped. I thought that the question of the private sector is, I think, it's very worrying. The number of billionaires that you highlight, an enormous amount of billionaires, and then if you take that down a bit lower, and how many multi-millionaires there are, and then how many millionaires there are, and how many people are earning over 100,000 or 300,000 pounds a year, whatever it is in the Chinese currency. That's an enormous number of people and an enormous number of inequality that's existing. And I think it was one of the comrades did say at the last meeting, you know, they should have woken up to it before now about this in China, about this inequality and what they need to do about it. And it seems to be at the moment some sort of a holding operation and trying to claw back from the advance of the private sector. And I just want to take that thing you said about the efficiency and innovation that the private sector is bringing, and I don't know the truth of that. I think we've discussed in the past about the nature of the system, the nature of the capitalist system, whereby you know, these so-called small and medium companies gradually get bigger, and the small ones, they flout regulations and pay low wages and stuff like that, and but they are driven and subject to private profit. You know, I'm not saying anything here that people don't know, but I'm just trying to remind ourselves of it in the debate. You know, the failure to invest, the limited use value of a lot of the products we get made for us, the fashion goods, the low quality, the consumerism of what we are asked to buy, the slick sales methods, and not forgetting the shareholder profits that drive it all, monopoly and restrictive practices that you already mentioned. And in many of this stuff, when these companies fail, important companies, the taxpayer ended up bailing them out. So I think we just must remind ourselves that these aren't these private companies are not necessarily the cavalry coming over the hill. It's a very dangerous situation potentially. The larger companies, and picking up this point on, and look, we talked about when we did the session on innovation. A lot of the innovation comes from the universities, the publicly financed research institutions, and all the rest of it. Doesn't come from the private companies, and so I think there's a potentially a bit of a false premise about what's going on, and I mean, as you said, Pat, we're looking at it from our own position in the capitalist country, looking at how it works here. I'm not sure where it works in China. I do, looking up, there was this company called the Peterson Institute for International Economics that I looked up, and they'd done a study in March in 22 in the private sector advances in China and the evolving ownership structures of the largest companies. And looking through some of that stuff they were putting out, it was saying, that the way they're classified, and some of the state-owned enterprises are not necessarily wholly owned or even majority owned by the Chinese state, and there's a spider web of lines of different groups and institutions, etc., that make up these different companies. And I would argue that, and as you pointed out, Pat, after the Second World War in Britain, there was an enormous success of the public sector, the house building programs, the National Health Service, all the utility companies that were publicly owned, all the advancements in oil exploration, even in the British Leyland, the car companies, there was a lot of success in those companies, and the arguments that we've always been putting, and that comes back to the last bit you were talking about, which was the involvement of the people in running society. That our complaints was that, notwithstanding the fact that that the private, they were competing in the private sector, a lot of the public sector companies, where was I? Forgot the point I was going to make. Oh yeah, the control, and we went through periods of industrial democracy, which wasn't really any control by working people, and it's the control by working people, and the point you've made in your last bit of your talk there, how the experimentation that could be done and the things that could be done to involve people and make things more democratic, and I think that's important, because that is people being involved and owning the running of the society and knowing how it works. What else was it I wanted to say? Yeah, because looking at the way they seem to, or Xi Jinping seems to look at things, and they talk about, Marxism with Chinese characteristics. Well, what does that really mean? And I've even heard some of other countries talking about they can do things with like Marxism with Japanese characteristics, or Marxism with Indonesian. I mean, what does it mean? And when he talks, and it does appear when you listen to Xi Jinping speak, he is interested in the welfare of the people, And I'll just quote some of the things he says here. That he says, provide new assistance for human. This is a speech he made not long ago. Provide new assistance for human beings to explore the path of modernisation and innovate theories and practices of human social modernisation and make contributions. And that we must adhere to the concept of putting the people first and highlight the people's nature in the direction of modernisation. The people are the creators of history, the most solid foundation of the deepest force for advancing modernisation. Keeps talking about modernisation. The ultimate goal of modernisation is to realise the free and comprehensive development of human beings. Whether the path of modernisation can ultimately be made feasible and stable depends on whether we can persist in putting the people at the centre. So, you know, I think, as you were suggesting, the potential to make arguments put forward, how you break through that bureaucracy, because part of the problem of democracy even is that once people get into positions of power, they don't want to give them up, and they lose. We see it even in political parties and in trade unions. Things that we must look at in a lot more detail about rotation and time limits on people's positions, etc., right of recall and all that stuff, democracy. Because it does fail even in a lot of our even left political parties, let alone the society as a whole. And I think we need to, we've done a lot of work on that in some of the documents we've done before. And I think I don't know if it's going to be a document, but we did talk about the ideas of putting links into other concepts. This democracy one is something I think that we need to talk through in a lot of detail. So yeah, I think that I agree with what you say about reformism, that the ideas that we've got to put forward reform, we can't be some sort of, it doesn't even work in Britain, in the capitalist system, let alone arguing for the overthrow of the system in China. So I'd go along fully with what you said about the Margaret's restrictions, and hopefully that we can continue this discussion, and hopefully as you say, when you get your YouTube thing going, we can get feedback and get more people involved who are experts in different fields that can add to the debate. Yeah, sorry I went on too long really, but I mean, and my mind's going a bit, so I'm forgetting things. So yeah, that's my little.
Thanks, Roy.
10 pen.
Excellent. Okay. Keep coming, comrades. Next one. Temos. You're muted, I think.
Yes, I was trying to unmute myself. Well, I think we've had an excellent analysis by Pat, and I think it's the best analysis I've heard about China as a whole in the last period, and I would agree with 99% of what Pat says. Of course, the 1% that remains, it is still important, and I shall try to go into this. But the main ideas of what's going on in China is I believe myself that it's exactly the way Pat described them. However, starting from the point he made, which I think is correct, that it's all this has relevance only if there is a sizable socialist force of Chinese people living in China, working there and acting in it. It's all of little practical importance. And I think that I would go a step further and say that looking at China alone is probably the wrong thing to do these days. I mean, China it looks fairly stable these days compared to what is happening in the West, in the other capitalist countries. It's probably stable even in comparison with Russia, while there I'm not too sure. I mean, if Putin didn't invade Ukraine, probably the stability of Russia would be far, far better than the stability in the West. I would also try to compare the quality of governments in the various countries, and we shouldn't forget that the more a country is advanced, the more it reaches its limits, the more it's becoming sort of mature, the less the quality of the leaders matters. I mean, it's no accident that today in most of the capitalist world we see leaders of doubtful, very mediocre abilities, and most of the work is being done automatically under the hood by people who are bureaucrats or millionaires or exerting influence in various sorts of ways. And I'm afraid that China is probably going through that phase when the government is still very important in playing the role of the mediator among the various monopolies, the monopolies and the people, and trying to have a sort of overall control in facing Western attacks and facing foreigner imperialist, in fact, threats coming from the West. And I don't know whether the future there is a government that is going to become more important for the Chinese society, Chinese economy, or less important, in the sense that we shall be moving into, without realizing it, as we did in the West, in a situation where powerful economic interests are controlling the government behind the scenes rather than directly opposing it. What we see in China today, I think, is not a sort of distorted or degenerated government of a worker state, but rather more like an indirect instrument of the real powers of the future in China, that are the big monopolies. The other thing that I would like to extend, in fact, what Pat said, is this Engels that saying about the monopolies as when they are important from societies, they should be integrated under the control of society. I must say this is a good reminder by Pat, because I was arguing for this only reference with Lenin, really. But it's good to be reminded that Engels was probably the first to approach this situation, and we shouldn't be opposing the monopolies as an idea, but we should oppose the private ownership of monopolies. And this is something that I think it's very important in today's world, not only China. And in China, we are early days yet, so we shall have probably a revolutionary change or a very big change in quite some future time. But this is not the case in the West. In the West is crumbling. I mean, monopolies are doing everything today, and unless they are taken over, they are going to destroy what everything civilization has built, because of their practices, because of their power, because of the control of the media, because of the control of government. And I suspect that what we should be concentrating on, even with regard to China, is what is happening in the West, in the sense that if a revolution happens now in China, from one of these movements that we have seen in the past, it's not going to lead to socialism. It's probably going to lead directly to the collapse of the Communist Party, yes, but the taking over by the monopolies has happened in Russia. I mean, because people are still aspiring for Western-style democracy, and when they find out that this is not what they bargained for, it will be too late. So I find interesting this reform and revolution comparison by Pat, and I think it's wrong to put it in such stark terms, reform or revolution. I think that's the main problem with the epigons of Lenin and Trotsky, that revolution was something completely different from reform. I mean, I said many times in the past, and I think I made a presentation here, that when we are within a revolutionary process, a revolution starts always with a reform, and the reform produces a revolution. So these two are not opposed to each other. It's just we shouldn't forget that the revolution will be imposed by the ruling classes in them, and it's not something that we choose. So what we are fighting of is we should be fighting the everyday battles that come forward, and stop parroting that the socialism will solve everything. We know that it may be correct as a statement, but it's not useful as a line of action. I mean, unless people understand what they are fighting for, unless people understand at every stage the reasons they are coming out into the streets, and they are fighting, and they are striking, and they are organizing, and they are having their political fights, and having their trade union struggles. They are not going to come to join a puny sect somewhere because it has good ideas. And in this sense, I think that such analysis as Pat has made today is very important, but we should be careful not to give the impression that we expect that China is going to be the beacon for the revolution. To do that, we should be waiting a few decades later than the collapse of the capitalist system. So time-wise, we should be concentrating on what the real struggles are in front of us, and try to engage with these struggles so that we go forward. I mean, such struggles we have seen happening in Greece, We have seen them happening in the Arab world, in the Arab Spring. We have seen them happening in Iran. Now, I think that's one of the places of real possibility of revolution. And of course, we have seen this in Britain with Bernie Sanders, with Jeremy Corbyn. We have seen it in America with Bernie Sanders. And these are the crucial things that the left should not miss. We missed the Bernie Sanders revolt. We missed the Jeremy Corbyn revolution because there was no real mass left movement that could understand this thing. It was a real chance in both cases. It was a real chance in Greece. Well, now we don't know. I mean, we can see another probable collapse of the world economy. I don't know whether what they can succeed or not in curbing the ramifications of the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank. I think this is the sort of international perspective that we should all have in mind when we are discussing these things. And I'm really very excited by what Pat said. Then I'm going to definitely to find time to read the longer document. But what Pat said today, it really gives, I think, a very good starting point of understanding China. And for me, contrary to probably to some of the other comrades, it's an indication of the time scale that China has as a stable country moving towards capitalism.
Thanks, Samos. Another comrade? Maybe one of the Pakistani comrades would like to come in. Khalid, maybe you'd like to say something? Or Sajjad, Wali?
But
Pat, I can give a quick question.
Mike, yeah, Mike, yeah,
Okay.
sorry, Mike, go ahead, Mike.
you're right, okay. You know, we face in Guyana a similar situation in the sense that we have the ruling party is the communist, what used to be called the Communist Party, but didn't have that name, the People's Progressive Party. And we experienced that period when Burnham, who became the president in 1960-something, 1965.
64, yeah.
64, 65, and the right-wing coalition government. Without going into all the history of it, he and the Communist Party, they weren't in a coalition, but they were able to nationalize 80% of the economy, 80% of the commanding height of the economy. In fact, he dismantled the colonial structure. Burnham, a little bit of his history, he was a member of the Communist Party in Britain when he was studying law in the United Kingdom. And Jagan, who studied in the United States, became a member of the American Communist Party. So when both of them came back, they came back with that sort of thinking, basically Stalinist. I didn't think you said much about Stalinism because I think it's important that we, as Marxists, understand that what the Chinese are doing, because the Chinese, as you remember, supported Stalin. Mao supported Stalin, and they were very upset with Khrushchev, and they broke with the international. Those are important points to remember. So the Chinese are essentially Stalinists. They have not moved away. They have learned quickly the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they began to, as everybody knows, to introduce capitalists, private capitalists, or a part of, and it has now engulfed the country, as you just pointed out, in terms of the level of corruption. Where there are lots of videos, that are being put out now. A lot of them illustrate the corruption that's going on in the Chinese, as you quite rightly pointed out. So the question is how do we deal with those trends? And Thomas raised a very important point. What would we be barking in the dark if we don't get these ideas into China? That's the essential thing. We've got to get these ideas into China. And for me, I mean, everybody here knows what it is that is happening there. So it's no point discussing here what we all know. The question is, how do we get, what method and what strategy or tactics we use to get these ideas into the place where we are focusing on? And that is, I think we should spend more time actually discussing that. It's all well and good to have a book put out and so on, but I think that we have to look at what is going on in the communication world, how we can effectively use means of communication, how we can use all the methods of modern communication system. And by the way, you know also that the Chinese are spending billions of dollars in the development of new technology and using robots and so on for artificial intelligence. So they're right up on the top. In fact, they surpass every other country in the world in terms of new artificial intelligence. So we have to look into all of that. We have to look into and study the system, the Chinese system, in terms of how do they communicate with their people, and if we can tap into the kind of I don't think that we could, like the others groups, that you can bash China. I don't think that's a right way of doing it. I think we need to get into it in a friendly manner, and once we get into the structures at the lower level, and be seen to be friends rather than just criticizing for the sake of it. I found this interesting, and I had to change my tactics in terms of how I criticize this establishment here, which is, as I said, is Stalinist. It's the Communist Party that's running the country. The guy who is the vice president is the fellow who studied in Moscow, at the Lubomba school. So we're not talking to fools. These guys know exactly what they're doing. But then you see they have this attitude, which is a Stalinist method or philosophy, which says that you have to build a highly developed capitalist economy before you're able to build socialism. And that's what we were taught in the Soviet Union and these Eastern Bloc countries. When you go there, you basically study Stalinism, that you can't actually develop a non-capitalist path of development, and that's something that we need to discuss. You've mentioned some of that, some features of that, how they could do things in a different way and achieve. Well, on the question of housing, I mean, nowhere are they talking about co-ops. Cooperatives are key to actually the development of the rural areas. And it's a difficult thing to do. I remember studying in East Germany, and the professor said, who was teaching us agriculture, he said his father was the last person to join the co-op. His father was the last person to join the co-op because farmers have this type of a mentality. China is still largely an urban country. And it has to produce, it has to develop agriculture, agro industry in a way in which it can feed its own people, apart from exporting food abroad. So I think, Pat, I am suggesting that we discuss different aspects of the Chinese economy and the politics there. We must discuss different aspects of it in much more detail than just running over it as you have done. I know you don't have time to do it, but we should discuss co-ops, whether it's functioning. And what I'm saying is that if we are going to advise or be advisors to the Chinese government and people, we have to come up with creative ideas, and we have to be able to have dialogue with them and show them that things that cooperatives in some of the biggest co-ops are in Europe, Western Europe. In fact, the biggest one that Professor Richard Wolff always talk about is the one in the one in Spain or Italy, which is very, very, very big. We have big co-ops in England too. So that's one way of them bringing people together on self-help to build their own homes, and teaching them how to do that. And they have enough technology and technological skills to be able to bring people together. The problem they have, which is part of the Stalinist system, as somebody quite rightly pointed out, are they willing to, the bureaucracy, are they willing to give up power? Are they willing to involve people in an organized way so that they actually can gain access and control their own lives? And that's the problem. That's the biggest problem you have. And there has to be another political revolution to actually overthrow this bureaucracy that exists here. That's my little piece, Pat.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Khalid, are you there? Are you available?
Yeah, Pat, I'm here.
Oh, okay. Perhaps you might like to respond to any of the points either that I made or that the comrades have made in discussion, or thoughts you might have, other thoughts you might have.
No, I think, Pat, in my opinion, the three, the biggest challenges that China is facing today is one is how to control and contain the rising power of the private sector. They have launched some measures, they have introduced some policies, but I don't think that is enough to contain the private sector, and they are getting stronger and stronger. Despite the one good thing is that the Chinese government now started to realize, they have realized that they need to contain that, but how to do that? It's interesting to see. And the other thing, I think, a lot depends on the policy. Now the Chinese government is experimenting in two provinces, is the common prosperity, and they want to reduce the inequality in China. So it will be interesting to see how they are going to drive this policy and what will be the results of that, because the Chinese government is hoping that through this common prosperity policy, they will be able to not only to raise the living standards of the working people in China, but also they wanted, through this policy, they also wanted to contain the billionaires and all these things. But I think as far as the private sector will continue to exist in China, and the Chinese companies, because the problem I think is one thing, that or the Chinese government controlling the the public ownership of the biggest companies or monopolies, as Timos was saying. But how they are operating, I don't think that is now, we might discuss it in the next session, but I think it's linked with that how the Chinese public sector, private sector companies are operating in the different countries. I think that also needs to be addressed, the issue of the working conditions, the wages, the low wages, the super exploitation of the workers, And in that sense, whether they are the Chinese state companies or the private sector companies, when they are involved in the in different projects in different countries, I think they need to adopt a new policy to be more sensitive towards the issues of workers' exploitation, the low wages, the the working conditions, and all these things. And when they are bringing in some regulations for the private companies working inside China, they also need to do it for the companies, the Chinese companies are working outside. And that is bringing a lot of, because of that, there's a lot of confusion among the working class people, like in Pakistan, because of the many projects they did. And the other thing I think is the question of democracy. I don't think we need to come up with a detailed program how to do that, how to reform the Chinese Communist Party, the economy, and the society, in general, and how to democratize the economy and the state. I think that is the biggest challenge the Chinese leadership at the moment has on their hand. I think that because they have introduced some measures on the in the local communities and in the local government system, they're trying to make it more responsive, more they want to involve more people into it. But I think it's really very little what has happened, how the Chinese system has built, the bureaucratic system, and the top-down model. And I think once the China started to make economy and the society and the party more democratic and the state, I think that will be the time when the people, most of the working class people and ordinary people, they will start to sympathize with the Chinese, and they will start to understand, because that is a big issue, and that gives a lot of ammunition, to the capitalist and the capitalist media to propagate against China and all these things. And also, I think we need to explain why the Chinese, as Pat, did in the document, and that how we need to clarify that how the Chinese democracy will be different, and what are the main aspects of that, and all these things. So I think these are the main challenges that China, is facing, and we also have to look at, I think I will end with that. If the other comrades wants to make some points, I think it's yeah. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks, Khalid. Great. All right. Roy, did you? I think you wanted to come back on something. Was it, Roy?
Well, I was just going to come in with a quick question, really, as no one was speaking. But it was just a comrade made the point in the last session we had about what does China do in terms of its developing socialism, if you like, internationally, and they seem to, their foreign policies seems to be very economic, in that they'll come along and build you a massive new bridge or a railway or a housing estate and charge you and go away again, and they'll do it fairly and quickly. And Russia seems to have a similar attitude. There doesn't seem to be any idea, on the surface of it, maybe they are behind the scenes. You know, that perhaps they're trying to set some example with their, you know, it seems to be that they predominate because they control the wealth, in the sense that the public sector is big enough to be able to control the banks and the main large industry, etc. But where's the education? Where's the attempt to not just see friendly companies, or just we'll do business with anyone who want to do business with us, just to because we want a multipolar society. Well, that's a multipolar capitalist society. I mean, that's not developing socialism. You know, the question is, you know, are they, or will they, or should we be? What's their arguments there that they should be putting forward? What is socialism? What is the end game, if you like, for them, for the Chinese? You know, it's not just about being consumerist. It's not just, what's the words they use, prosperity. What does that mean? When, as you said, Pat, the health service is poor and all the rest of it. Where are they going? You know, and what? How do they spread the word, sort of thing? Yeah, it's just in my mind what you might think about it, really.
Yeah, well, we are going to talk about that in our next session. So,
and
okay. Our Chinese have actually got a very crafty plan, so I'll explain.
I just wanted to mention something.
Mike. Yeah.
You know, the Chinese have a powerful health philosophy. One of the problems that they have is that they're moving away from their own culture. So if they were to actually develop their health system based on their own health philosophy and their own culture of actually you pay the doctor, what was it? There's that different doc. You pay the doctor not to make people get ill. You see, they have a good health system, a good eating habit, but it's becoming highly, what you may call, westernized. A lot of Western ideas are pumped into the Chinese system of health and their way of living and so on, and that has become very clear because of the control that the private sector has got and the way in which they've used it to their advantage. But if they were to have an education system where they teach their people how to eat, the kind of food they should eat, and exercise, and all these basic things and so on of life, the people would not get ill, and they don't need to have this elaborate drugs and pharmaceutical company that we see in the West.
Point, Mark. Okay, so I think if the comrades are happy with that, I'll just come back and respond quickly to some of the points that have been made, and then we can wrap up the session. Unless there's a comrade who hasn't spoken who wants to come in. Yeah, speak now or forever hold your peace, as they say. All right, so now Roy was the first comrade who came in, and he talked about democracy. Now, the interesting point about that is that the Trotskyist movement historically used to hold on, let me do one thing here. Yeah, so the Trotskyist movement historically used to come up with slogans in the Soviet Union, Soviet bloc countries, and why I'm talking about the Trotskyist movement is that you've got to bear in mind that the Trotskyist movement was the main opposition to Stalinism in the late 1920s and 1930s in particular. And so their failure to have any impact, meaningful impact on the development of events in the, there were a lot of movements to reform within the Soviet bloc system, and we had in 1956 we had in Hungary and Poland. In 1968 we had in Czechoslovakia the Prague Spring. Then in 1980-81 we had the Solidarność movement, Poland. Of course, we had the big movement at the end of the Soviet Union, 1985, when Gorbachev came to power, and we had all the big movements in Eastern Europe in the late 1989-88 period. And the failure of the Trotskyists to come to have a big impact in that is weird, is strange if you think about it, given that Trotsky's role as the main opposition to Stalin, and the role of the Trotskyists and the literature they put out, excellent literature they put out in the 1930s. Why was it that Trotskyism was not able to have the impact? And I go into that in a little bit of detail in the document, but the more you look into it, for example, the strategy they had of trying to overthrow the Communist Party, I think, was unrealistic. But and particularly when you saw that almost all the movements that for change in the Soviet bloc that did happen came from within the Communist Party. I think that's very significant. But also that the program that the Trotskyists had in the Soviet bloc was a maximalist program. They didn't put forward any program for any reforms in the system. They just put forward the idea of political revolution, down with the rule of the Communist Party, and in its place would be ruled by the Soviets, a workers' democracy. And they didn't go into any more detail than that. It was kind of few slogans. And of course, that didn't gel with the data. I mean, for example, those ultra-left characters in the workers' movement in the left, we don't see many of them nowadays, but there used to be more of them in the West, where they just come forward with a maximalist program, and they don't put forward, as Temos talked about it, it's not reform or revolution, it's reform and revolution, isn't it? And you have to put forward a whole series of reforms. You have to get involved in worker struggles. So the workers might be fighting for a shorter working week or a wage increase or whatever. And by our participation in those fight for reforms, we build up our forces and we win over workers to the idea of not just reform, but a revolution or a complete transformation of society. And we learned that, and we know that without that, if you just come forward to workers and said, I remember there was a famous, it's going back to 1959, but there was a group called the Socialist Party of Great Britain, who were one of these kind of abstract propagandist, maximalist groups, and they didn't involve themselves in the class struggle. But then there was in 1959 there was a big national bus workers strike, and their headquarters that happened to be around the corner in Clapham Common from a bus garage. So the workers came into work on the picket line. They came onto the picket line and they saw this huge wall. And overnight, these socialists had written, abolish the wages system. That had been their slogan, right? These workers were fighting for, I think it was 6p on their 6p an hour on their wage packet. And then they all looked puzzled at this fucking slogan. And it was so abstract. And if you fight for a maximalist revolution and you don't fight for reforms, then you're never going to get anywhere. And that was the situation of the Trotskyist movement in the Soviet bloc. They never came forward with any practical ideas for how to democratize the system, how to put the workers in power at a local level or in the factories, and how to involve the customers, and whatever. So that I think was one of the main reasons why they never succeeded. So I agree with you that we have to go into more detail about democracy. I think that Khalid made the same point. The other thing was about the very good point that Roy made about was that, are the capitalist companies more efficient, really? Now, I think you can probably argue that when the capitalist companies are relatively new and they're building up, someone like Elon Musk, for example, I don't want to go into the ins and outs of that character, but as an engineer, there's no question, but he is driven You know, he sleeps on the factory floor and works like 15 hours a day. I think he's autistic as well, but he's a driven and he's a very good engineer, and so all the workers respect him. But what happens with most companies is that the founder of the company maybe makes the company very innovative and efficient in the early days, but then over time that founder dies, retires, whatever, and the capitalist companies become more and more bureaucratic. So for example, the workers in Tesla, who are making the electric cars, they laugh at the setup in General Motors. And I've seen interviews with people who've gone from General Motors to work in Tesla, and they said it's just a complete revolution in the way they work. And they talk about how inefficient and bureaucratic the big companies are compared to this new upcoming company. So it is probably true that the newer companies tend to be more efficient and more innovative, but that comes as I think we're always pointing out, they become more and more bureaucratic. Now, one of the things, the other aspects of this is that if you look at these companies that are becoming huge, the technology companies, the financial companies, the main reason why they're becoming huge is because there's no input from customers. Now, why do I say that? Because these bastard companies are completely overcharging for their services. That's why they're becoming so. Why do you think it is that these companies become so profitable so quickly? Because they charge a fortune. I mean, if the customers had any say on it, they wouldn't allow them to charge all this money for the software they're charging. And you know, look at Microsoft. They charge in hundreds of dollars for their programs when they've done all the work on their programs and only doing small amounts of modernization over the years. The same with the financial services. They're ripping us off left, right, and center, and they're taking our money and they're gambling with it. So of course the customers don't want this, but they've got no say in the running of it. And then you've got the role of the workforce. If you look at the way even the new companies like Tesla, they don't allow Tesla, Amazon, Google, they don't allow trade unions in their workforce. Tells you everything, doesn't it? You know, so it's if we had more democratically publicly owned, the traditional publicly owned company, I mean, I think we all know, tends to be somewhat bureaucratic and slow. It may be very solid in what it does achieve, but it tends to be quite slow and inefficient about it when you compare it to these new, very fast-moving companies in technology and finance and so on. But if these companies, publicly owned companies, actually involve the people they're affected, the workforce, customers, they could be far more efficient than these new companies. And that's what I'm getting at. So on the new Chinese theory of modernization, Roy questioned why Xi Jinping kept mentioning modernization. Well, that will come into the next session, so don't worry about that. Because what the Chinese have developed is a new ideology of modernization, and to contrast to the old bourgeois approach to modernization. It's quite interesting. One thing I would pick Roy up on is that he talked about reform or revolution in the West, and kind of said that that, you know, what difference is it? Well, the problem in the West, in the capitalist system, is that you have a capitalist class that owns the wealth, that dominates the state, and will not allow reforms. That's the difference. And the only way you can actually achieve reforms ultimately in the West is through a revolution, a social revolution at that. So I think that Themos is dead right that it's not reform or revolution, but revolution is a key part of it. And you know, we can see that, can't we? That all the reforms we achieved in the West are all being lost. And the neoliberalism, they're taking back the reforms. So even to keep our conditions, the old reforms, we need a revolution. That's ironic, isn't it? One thing about the question of political revolution in China, if you look at, for example, the approach of the CWI, they set up the CWI set up. They recruited some comrades in Hong Kong, where before this, you know, the crisis of the last few years and the changes, Hong Kong was basically a capitalist country. It was a capitalist section of China, and you had freedom of speech and all the other things, trade unions or whatever. So the comrades recruited comrades in Hong Kong, and they used those to go into mainland China. And what did they try to do? They didn't try to reform the existing trade union movement, which is the largest in the world, 250 million members. They went out to build independent trade unions. And of course, and they did it as part of a strategy of overthrowing the Communist Party. So what do you think the reaction of the Communist of the government was? They suppressed it. The same problem happened with the IMT, but what they did was they set up these Marxist discussion societies in the university. But what they were preaching was the overthrow of society. So of course, what do you think the reaction of the Communist Party machinery was? And they suppressed it. And that's the reality. If you go for a political revolution in a Stalin society, it's not like a capitalist society. We've got so much experience of this from the Soviet bloc era. If you go to try to get a political revolution, you're suppressed, and you can't build anything. You can't gain traction. So that's from a practical point of view, it doesn't work. Themos made some very good points there. First one he made was about we need to have Chinese people involved, and I agree with that. Otherwise, it's important for us to have a position on China and understand China, but beyond that, it's a political abstract position, isn't it? But that's why I'm launching this YouTube channel, because that's a way for us to actually reach out to Chinese people. And a lot of Chinese people, as long as you, again, that's an interesting point, isn't it? The channels online that have a positive attitude towards China, even if they're critical, get large audiences of Chinese people. The channels that attack China from a hostile point of view get no Chinese people online. That's a test, isn't it? So I'm hoping that we will get a significant number of people, Chinese people involved, because without that, for example, another comrade raised, well, I'll come back onto that in a minute, but it raised a question about how could you, I think it was Mike who talked about how could you, or was it Halid, I can't remember, but how could you reform the Communist Party practically? What are the steps that you need to put forward for that? Or to reform the trade unions or other aspects? And we can't come up with that from outside of China. That could only be done by Chinese comrades, who know the situation in China and they know how the thing works and what's the best way to put that forward in a realistic way that would gain support among people. So, that's a classic example. One thing didn't quite understand what Themos was saying about. I kind of got the message that he said that we didn't need to be too focused on China because of all these struggles in the rest of the world. Well, I don't think we need to counterpose the two. I think we need to fight for wherever we are in the class struggle, for independent workers' struggles and build up our forces. But I would say that China is becoming increasingly a central focus for politics in the world. Certainly, it is here in Brazil, and it is in the developing world. And remember, the developing countries now often have bigger working classes than the richer countries. And China itself has the largest working class in the world. We shouldn't forget that. And as China gets stronger and stronger economically, the whole struggle internationally is focusing on China. So it's not just, the reason why America is focusing on China and is possibly going to try to provoke a war with China is because China is taking on the leadership of more and more countries, and China is becoming the main trading partner of most countries in the world. So I think that, and that I think is going to grow. So now that brings me on to the question Halid raised about what will make people support China. And I agree with him. Obviously, if China was to develop more and more experiments in democracy, meaningful experiments, that would help. But I would say probably even more fundamental is that as China grows stronger and stronger economically and raises the living standards of the people and gets further and further ahead on technology and so on, then then the rest of the world are going to say, more and more people are going to say, well, what the hell are they doing in China? Meanwhile, in the West, it's going downhill and imploding and turning in on itself. Then more and more working people and academics and you name it are going to say, well, maybe we should do what China's doing. And I think that process is already happening, as we can see why China is now leading a big coalition of countries against the West. And I suspect that will happen even more as China gets stronger, gets more ahead on technology. There's another point about, Mike made the point about Stalinism. Well, I see where he's coming from, and he's right, that in essence, if you look at the way the Chinese communism operates, for example, Chinese Communist Party operates on the basis of democratic centralism, which is ridiculous. I mean, we have arguments about whether we should have democratic centralism operating in the left organizations, but how the hell, when you've got an organization, the Chinese Communist Party, with nearly 100 million members, which is running the whole of society, how can it work on the basis of democratic centralism? I mean, how can they exclude, even on a practical basis, the rest of the population who are not in the Communist Party from decision making? And never mind decision making, even to know what the debates that are going on inside the Communist Party are. You know, these are all parts of democratic centralism, that, you know, we keep it secret, we have our internal debates. And in practice, actually, the ordinary members of the Communist Party don't get much involved in that. So it tend to be discussions at the top, like it was, you remember, in the CWI and the IMT. Discussions are taken at the top by the IS, International Secretariat, and then they have they implement democratic centralism and then present a united front to the International Executive Committee, and they're supposed to present a united front to all the central committees. I mean, it's just ridiculous. That was ridiculous, and this is even more. Would be even more ridiculous that if they have internal debates at the top of society and they don't let anybody know about them. But of course, in practice, it doesn't flow like that. I mean, a lot of these debates, people do get to know what's going on, and different parts of the communist movement debate them. So I think Stalinism is no longer, you know, Stalinism is no longer a good description for this system, because all the methods of Stalinism, a lot of those methods have died away. I mean, for example, in China, Trotsky's works are everywhere. Anywhere, any bookshop you want to, you can find them. Trotsky. The reason being is that the Chinese fell out with the Soviet Union, and so they became more free on these questions. So, you know, and there's this idea that everybody has to keep quiet in China. Well, it isn't like that. You know, people use all the social media, and as long as they don't talk about sort of the most controversial issues like Hong Kong or Xinjiang or whatever, they talk about everything else, you know, going on in society. And there's like hundreds of millions of people chatting every day about these things, and the Communist Party doesn't have any problem with it. Another question Mike made is that we have to get these ideas into China, and I already made my point about that. That's why the YouTube channel idea. On the question of cooperatives, actually, China, because of its history, is using a lot of cooperatives in the rural areas. There's not a lot, unless you study this area, and I followed some of it, you don't know what's going on in the rural areas in agriculture. And so China is using a lot of cooperatives all over China, and that's because of its history of communes and so on that have continued. Now, the idea of using co-ops, for example, in house building, and also running, you know, when you've got housing estate, having a cooperative running it and so on, I think are excellent ideas. And Mike was right to raise that. I think public ownership works at a higher, you know, a bigger size. But when you get down to local level and smaller size, then cooperatives is obviously the way to go. We also, Mike made the point that we need to look at each area of the Chinese economy in detail. I agree with that, and that's why I'm doing this channel, because you need to have we're going to have a program every week looking at each area in detail, and over a period of time, 6 months, a year, 18 months, 2 years, then we can cover all these things. And as I said, by involving Chinese people in that, we can get feedback, and they can give us all the detail we need about it. On health, yeah, I think you're right, Mike, that the traditional Chinese health system, which we tend to look down on in the West, usual story, has many very important progressive aspects to it. And it's still it's still very popular in China, but there's no question it's being undermined by capitalist supermarket approach and the way they're eating, the diet and everything. But that will no doubt, as people become more have more high living standards, they become more conscious of these things, don't they? And that debate is developing in China. Khalid talked about the growing threat of the private sector, which I think is obviously the key question we have. That Jonathan, we tried to make a special effort to get Jonathan involved in these discussions because he's done quite a lot of study of this subject, and he makes the point that one of the reasons why China's economy has been so successful is because of the clash and the interplay between the public sector and the private sector, and that the private sector acts as a kind of discipline on the public sector. And I think he's right about that. but he does make the point, which I agree with, is that as the private sector gets bigger, especially with the new tech sector and the finance sector, there's a danger of the Chinese system being overthrown effectively, and therefore I think the leadership, the party leadership, is very aware of that, which is why they are bringing these steps to control these big companies. But I think that ultimately we have to have a new model. I think those are the main. If I've missed any points, I'm sorry, comrades, but I've tried to cover the main ones that I think that comrades raised. Oh, common prosperity. Sorry, Hallie did raise about common prosperity, and he mentioned, for example, that they've got two provinces where they're introducing special measures, and some of those measures are good, where local governments are giving free meals to their workforce. They give them, what they do is they, for example, I can't remember, where was it now? I think it was Hong Kong was one of them. Well, anyway, what they do is they give like a plastic card to their workforce, and they can use that in local restaurants for lunch and evening meal, and they get those meals incredibly cheaply. And things like that I think are very good. But these ideas where they're getting the billionaires to give to charity, to give back. I mean, I'm sorry, this is still leaving the decision making in the hands of these billionaires, isn't it? Who they're going to help and who they're going to. I mean, it's not a solution. So I think this common prosperity, which is an excellent slogan, that it's a bit like, you remember for the many, not the few slogan of Jeremy Corbyn. It was an excellent slogan, but it's how you put it into practice that's the important thing. And I think that again, this is something which Chinese comrades would be able to go into in more detail. Okay, comrades, thank you very much.